BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, it's Jack the producer here. Thank you for listening. Just a couple of bits of housekeeping before we get going today on the pod. First of all, it's Mike Costello back again for the first time in a month or so. As promised, he will pop up on the pod every now and again going forward. This week we're talking the historic night we had in Las Vegas. We're talking great trilogies and looking back on Manny Pacquiao's career after he announced his retirement. So stick around for that. Logistically, we had to record this episode in the middle of last week, so that's why there's no Chris Eubank Jr., Savannah Marshall or Huey Fury reaction in the pod today. We will come back to that next week. Also on next week, I'm conscious that we haven't had a lot of your emails in recently. Few technical issues on that side, but we will have some by next week. So get in touch, costelloandbunts@bbc.co.uk. Probably need to look at getting that email changed as well at some point. Also next week, we'll be looking ahead to Dillian White and Otto Wallin. We'll have full commentary of that on the following Saturday on 5 Live. So we'll have our usual full fight week coverage of that next week. And one last thing, apologies for the sound quality at the start of this pod. It does click into gear though after about 5 minutes or so. Thanks for listening.
5 Live Boxing.
Welcome to 5 Live Boxing with me, Steve Bunce, and as we've been warning you for several weeks now, he would make, and he will make, and he is making an appearance. Mike Costello is back for one show only. Well, for one show now, until he's on for another show at some point in the future. And it's been, I would say, a busy few weeks. That's an understatement. We'll have a little look at some fights that have taken place, maybe one or two that are taking place in the future, and we'll have a little look back, a glance back at Manny Pacquiao, and we'll go into Costello's archive on a trip he made once to the Philippines back in about 2010, when Manny was just had a wide-eyed dream of becoming a president. Hey-ho, as they say in the trade. Yes, he is back. Mike, before we get into Manny and looking back and trilogies, what did you make of the fight? Yes, that fight, the one in Las Vegas. Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder 3.
Oh, I thought it was absolutely remarkable, Steve. And by the way, it's great to be back, even despite the number of people on iTunes who've been saying how much better the show is since I've walked away.
I've been stunned by that. I've been stunned by that. Hand on
As
heart.
if people want to listen to Carl Frampton, George Groves and Barry Jones rather than me. I don't get it.
In all fairness, young Jack has put together one of the most serious boxing podcast rosters since your departure. It's been quite staggering, the amount of names. I fully expect him to call me up and say, yeah, we've just got Sugar Ray Leonard and the great translator working with Roberta Duran this week. It's been quite insane, the list he's put together. Sorry about that, son. It's got absolutely nothing to do with me, I can assure you.
But what a week I missed out on. I mean, I was listening day in, day out to the podcast. And I knew when I signed to move across to DAZN that there was a chance I would miss weeks like this. I mean, when I signed on the dotted line, it was nailed on that Anthony Joshua would fight Tyson Fury in Saudi Arabia on August the 14th. So I knew there were big weeks to miss, but this was one to miss. I mean, a real big miss. And there was serious envy. Although, you know, I was at a fantastic show in Liverpool, topped by Liam Smith, revitalising his career by beating Anthony Fowler. Terrific performance, cracking fight on the undercard between Ted Cheeseman and the new British super welterweight champion Troy Williamson. And then we all went back to the hotel, and Matchroom hired a suite with a giant screen. So there was a great atmosphere, Steve, building towards the main event. And surprisingly, there was a decent undercard as well, Steve, wasn't there? Which is not always the case on these big pay-per-view events in the States. So there was, just enough to keep everybody interested until the first bell. But it was one of those nights that I'll remember in a very different way, Steve. You know, in a great group of the Smith brothers were all there. All four of the brothers were there. It was a really good atmosphere in the suite as we waited for the fight to come around. But it was a very, very special night, Steve, wasn't it? One of the highlights of the 4.5 years of doing the podcast for me was that spell during lockdown where we focused on greatest fights. And, you know, if there was to be another lockdown of that kind for whatever reason in 10 years' time, we'd certainly be covering that fight. There's no question that now sits into that kind of catalogue. No question about it.
You know, there was a moment there, Mike, and obviously my night was split into two. the first 3/4 of the night, I was upstairs working with David Hay and Paul Dempsey. We were quite high, not quite as high as we've been in the past in that arena, but fairly high. So I came down just for the sort of ring walks for the main guys, and it just transformed. The arena transformed. The energy level went up. And I've got to tell you, and I sent you that text saying something like, I don't need to tell you, or I don't need to explain. It was quite unbelievable at ringside. And where I was, Mike, in the corner, and I know I talked about this last week in the pod, but where I was in the corner, Malik Scott's right elbow was on my left knee. That's how close I was. And I could feel him trembling, literally trembling, Mike, as he was squatted down, going through the shots, missing what he wanted to miss and highlighting what he wanted to highlight. Like, if Deontay Wilder, for instance, moved out of the way of a shot in round 3, he was getting so excited. And as Tyson Fury's jabs thumped in and thudded in, he was getting less and less excited. It was quite, we talk about privilege. We maybe overuse that word. Perhaps privilege is becoming a bit like legend. Perhaps we've overused that word too much. But Mike, it was serious. You missed one, son. You really did. But as the fight was unfolding, Mike, I'm intrigued because obviously I still haven't watched it back. All these days, I still haven't watched it back. What did it look like, say, in round 6 and 7 and 8?
Well, I think, Steve, one of the hallmarks of a great fight is the uncertainty that travels throughout the contest, and this was one of those. So when you talk about round 6 or 7 or wherever you were, there was still always that chance that, for as weak as Wilder looked, that he might land again at that stage. And it's easy to say now that, the overall impression in hindsight is that Fury was in control and didn't look badly hurt when he went down. I remember at the time that there was this great uncertainty around it all. But just before I develop all that, Steve, I just want to take you back to the fight week and also about what's happened in the heavyweight division, Steve, because if you think, going back to when I said there, when I moved away from the BBC, Joshua versus Fury for Saudi Arabia was nailed on for August the 14th. And when it didn't happen, there was almost a universal sadness in boxing that the heavyweight division was finished. And yet we've seen 2 remarkable fights in their different ways. And what I wanted to get from you was the kind of feeling we had in Liverpool as the week wore on. And we've known about these narratives down the years, Steve, about how the week started with Fury being absolutely certain to win the fight, and yet as gradually the fight came round, Wilder was given a bigger and bigger chance, and that so often happens. Was that the case in Vegas?
Yeah, it was. In fact, it was definitely the case in Vegas. Fury was sensational on the Monday in Bob Arum's office for his regular start of the week talk, but he was better than just normal, Mike. He was exceptional. He was absolutely brilliant. But then equally brilliant was Malik Scott all week long, doing whatever anybody wanted. Wilder didn't do anything, as usual, Mike. He didn't entertain the Americans. He certainly didn't entertain the Brits. But Malik was fantastic. And he was breaking down all of the fight entirely, breaking it down perfectly. And everything he said made sense. And there were attacks on him. There were assaults on him. The 96 seconds of his fight in San Juan, Puerto Rico was played and circulated. The suggestion that he just jumped on the floor. And you know what? It wasn't a great shot. He got half hit on the side of the head and he went down. But you know what? Getting half hit on the side of the head by Deontay Wilder still counts for an awful lot of punching, by the way, my friend. And trust me, you don't want Deontay Wilder to hit you on the collarbone, let alone half on the head. So that was discussed. So for every single instance of Malik Scott justifying Deontay Wilder's claims that he would win this third fight, there was someone to shoot him down. But by the end of the week, by about the time of the weigh-in, Mike, a lot of people had started to realise, me included, that we were going to see a different Deontay Wilder, that he did have this bit of confidence back. He did have a little bit of his old self back. And Malik Scott, for all of his unproven skills and assets, he'd won a lot of people over. And during that time, we'd also seen Fury bite. People tend to forget this. Fury definitely, he had a few bites as well. He lost his mind a little bit because of some backstage shenanigans and came out and said some things that were fairly unsavoury, which he did apologise for. So that's how bad they were, because he made instant apologies. It was a week of rough and tumble. Shelley Finkel got me and gave me an earful. We recorded a bit of it for the pod. And he did give me a bashing. He just said, why did you not call me? Why did none of you guys ever call me during the arbitration? The hearing which led to the fight that we talked about, Fury and Joshua falling out of bed. It was just one of those weeks with these set pieces day after day after day, and there was something every single day. I started the week believing that Fury would win comfortably, and I finished the week believing Fury would win, but win in a really, a hard and attritional fight, possibly a late stoppage. Now, I'm not one to pat myself on the back and be an after-timer, but I didn't do too bad with that one. I just had this feeling that Wilder wouldn't quit, and I knew nobody in his corner was going to be throwing any towels in any time soon. That was absolutely clear. It was, Mike, without doubt, a special event. You mentioned the undercard there, Mike. There were 3 heavyweight title fights. Sorry, 3 heavyweight. I think they probably were for different titles. 3 heavyweight fights, a real varied mix. Now, I have to be absolutely honest with you. I thought they all fell short of what we were hoping for and what we were looking for. And I was mildly under-impressed with all of them. I know that Adam Kalnachi, the Polish guy, suffered an orbital wound damage in the first round, so that's why his fight with Helenius was so one-sided. But the jury remains out on the 2 other stars that were being pushed there, one of whom got beat. Frankie Sanchez, the Cuban, beat the Jagger. They fell a little bit short. It was all about the main fight. It was all about the big event. It was all about the fervour, and it was some nights. And you were, I know I've said it before, you were sorely missed.
Yeah, I missed out too. But going to the fight itself, Steve, and looking at the pattern of the fight, if you look at the last 3 weeks or so and how important they've been for the heavyweight division, what was turning into a dismal year for the heavyweight division has turned into a really important year for the heavyweight division, completely revitalised the division. I'm doing a fight in a few weeks' time between Dillian Whyte and Otto Wallin, and that's suddenly got a whole new quality and a whole new value around that fight. And that's what's happened to the heavyweight division, because there are now so many more permutations as to what could happen. But looking at that fight, I remember this coaching clinic that I mentioned on the podcast many times, Steve, that I went to with Emmanuel Stewart back in 2011. And he said that great fights tend to elevate the status and the reputation of both men involved. And that's what happened this weekend. Fury didn't necessarily need it, but Wilder did, and he got it. Whatever the controversy in the immediate aftermath when Tyson Fury was saying he didn't accept, his kind of sportsmanship at the end of the fight, for the performance within the fight, how close he came to beating Tyson Fury, how close he came to becoming the first man ever to beat Tyson Fury. And I thought there were some interesting developments in the fight, how he was working to the body in the opening round. I think that there is some scope there for some damage to be done to Tyson Fury at some stage with body shots, not necessarily the jab to the body that Wilder was throwing, but a more concentrated attack to the body. That's, of course, if the opponent can ever get near Fury, because he is so clever at making opponents miss. And there are 1 or 2 still shots around, Steve. I was looking at one still shot last night where Wilder has thrown the jab, and Fury has just dropped his right shoulder. He's let the jab go over his shoulder and thrown his own jab, which is crunching against the chin of Wilder. It's in the corner. I can't tell what round it is, but they both look, it looks like it's some way into the fight. And there's just that to me, that kind of one cameo was a sign of sometimes how easy Tyson Fury finds this game. It just comes so naturally to him to make an opponent miss. So for all I'm saying there about, there might be some susceptibility in the future if somebody was to go to the Fury body. He seems to have an answer for everything. And of course, the ultimate criteria, the great fights have to sway one way, then the other, and back again. And this did that. As far as trilogies are concerned, Steve, a weakness for me is that all the great trilogies have a situation where both men won. Yeah. And this is a trilogy in which Deontay Wilder hasn't won. And it's one in which you couldn't even make an argument for him winning the first fight. Not for me anyway. I mean, all the arguments around the first fight are that Fury should have got it. And it was, it was a judge to draw. So that, in terms of the great trilogies, all of those great trilogies, Ali, Frazier, Gatti and Ward, and Barrera against Morales, my 3 favourite trilogies in my lifetime, all had both men winning. And so that, that's just not that it isn't one of the great trilogies, but I think that to me just drops it down the list in terms, if you're going to rank trilogies, then that just drops it down the list, because you have to have each man winning one of them.
Equally, Mike, I could argue that there's something extraordinary about all 3 of the fights. So the first fight, we have that extraordinary resurrection in the last round when Tyson Fury goes down and is out cold, doesn't move for 3 or 4 seconds. Then in the second fight, we have the extraordinary ending that nobody possibly other than Gordon Ramsay and Gypsy Johnny Fury, Tyson Fury's father, could have predicted. And then in the third fight, we're served up something that almost defies the scripting walls of a Rocky film. So that would be my one. That would be my one. That would be my one comeback on the fact that there wasn't a winner, a loser, and then another winner. Yeah, that would be the one thing, because there are other trilogies that where one of the 3 fights is a really good fight, but it's nowhere near as good as fight number 1 or fight number 2 or fight number 3. Very, very clear and definite difference. Whereas this one served up, and I think it did serve up so many different ridiculous things, and such great backstories, and in all fairness, Mike, with the backdrop of COVID as well. And just to pick up on a point you made, Mike, and you're so right about this, is that we were guaranteed we were going to Saudi August the 14th. Then that fell through. And one of the things that's been a little bit annoying this last 3 or 4 weeks in the build up to Joshua and Usyk, and then in the build up to Wilder and Fury, is this general notion that these were in some way semi-finals for the final, which was going to be obviously Fury against Joshua. I was against that all the way through the Usyk and Joshua build-up, saying that this is a fantastic fight. This is a standalone fight. This is not an easy warm-up against the tiny Eastern European, which is a massive generalisation, but an awful lot of people thought that. And equally, the same thing with Wilder and Fury. There was even a sort of feeling out there early in the week, we've got this because we were ordered to have this. It's the court of arbitration that's made us have this. We don't want this fight. Well, that's rubbish. We said on this pod way back in the distant past, in late March and April, when Wilder invoked the trilogy clause, I think it was something like the 6th or 7th or 8th of April of last year, we said then, this is a fantastic third fight. It's just a little bit sad if there was an asterisk attached to the brilliant Saturday night at Tottenham Hotspur's ground and the brilliant Saturday night in Las Vegas at the T-Mobile. It's that some people still thought these were the lesser of the fights available. No, they were exceptional fights available, and they were exceptional fights on the night. 16 or 15 nights, that was, Mike, of British heavyweight boxing, of world heavyweight boxing. Take that 15 nights and place it anywhere in history, and you cannot come up with anything like what was delivered by those 4 men in those 2 venues in those 15 days.
And it's, often said, Steve, and it's a cliche for people who will be listening to this podcast, but, with a strong heavyweight division, that reflects really strongly on the rest of the sport. And I think, there's a revitalization about the whole sport after what's happened in those 15 or so days. And something else that struck me, Steve, was looking back at those trilogies that I mentioned, my 3 favorite trilogies in my lifetime, about how the second fight, the middle fight, is quite often the weakest fight. And that again was the case here with Fury and Wilder, in that the second fight, for all the narrative around it and all the excitement in the build-up because of the draw in the first fight, it was one-sided, the second fight. And, you look at Gatti and Ward, you look at Ali and Frazier, the second fight between Ali and Frazier was quite comfortably the most tedious of the 3, even though some praise Ali for his performance, others dig him for perpetually holding throughout the 12 rounds as it was in that second fight. But it is interesting how sometimes that second fight is a dip, whether the first fight has taken so much out of them, or it's created so much apprehension. It's a strange quirk in those trilogies that the middle fight is the weakest of them.
Yeah, but see, I would argue that the middle fight here, not as good in some ways as the first, and certainly not as good as the third fight. But I think it was the shock value of the unexpected which makes it as a standalone. Now, if they only fight one time and it was the middle fight, it would be incredible. If they only fight one time and it was the first fight, it would be incredible. If they only fought one time and it was the third fight, it would be incredible. Whereas that doesn't apply to some of those other trilogies. I think all three of those fights, as one-offs in isolation, stand any test of any time in any age. But a couple of things, first of all, point of order first. That Dillian White and Otto Wallin fight, which, again, I've had to give Dillian a bit of stick for taking it. That was 6 weeks ago. Now it looks like it's even a bigger risk. We're doing that as well on 5 Live, son, so we've got to be a little bit careful here. We don't upset too many people. And, Mike, throwing it forward now, where does this leave AJ?
Well, the rematch clause has been activated against Alexander Usyk, so that's going to happen next time around. And then if Anthony Joshua wins that fight, Steve, then I think the heavyweight division explodes again.
Oh,
and
man.
When we were looking for crumbs of comfort around August time, or whenever we missed out on the fight between Joshua and Fury, we did say that if they go away and they both win, that the fight could become even bigger. Well, they went away and one of them lost, and the fight's even bigger than it could have been under that first scenario. So if Anthony Joshua in the first 3 or 4 months of next year gains revenge over Alexander Usyk,
can he,
the
Mike,
fight
in your
against
opinion?
Tyson Fury, I think he can. I think he can. I don't think he will, but I think he can. And then the fight against Tyson Fury becomes much, much bigger than it ever was.
I left Spurs' ground a few weeks ago with that ridiculous walk. We had to walk about 3 miles to put Carl Froch in his car because there was gridlock around the stadium. It was absolutely crazy. I've never seen anything like it. It was brilliant. It was fun, and it was a warm night, bizarrely, but it was a bizarre night. And I remember walking with Carl Froch and having a chat with Carl. And I said then, I stopped him at one point, and we stopped in the middle of a street, and there were 1,000 people around us in cars that were going nowhere, and kebab shops that were doing endless business, and everybody was joyous, and it was just a lovely feeling. It was like a carnival. And I remember looking at Carl Froch and saying, Carl, if Joshua turns this around in the rematch, it will be the greatest revenge in the history of heavyweight boxing, because as much as people want him and will him to, it seems to me that on the night and since then, people just can't believe he can. What if he does? What if he were to get in there and pulverise and pound Usyk, just like Tyson Fury told me that that's what he would do. If he had Joshua in the gym, him and Sugar Hill Stewart would work for free to make Joshua into the heavyweight, to make him, Tyson's words, big again, and to beat Usyk. Can you imagine if he could exact revenge like that on Usyk in front of 70,000 people with Tyson Fury ringside? Boy, oh boy, Mike, you're absolutely right. A fight that was enormous just takes off in a direction that you need a rocket to chase it.
Absolutely. And, you know, some of what we saw in the 5th and 6th rounds of the fight between Anthony Joshua and Alexander Usyk gives you scope to believe that maybe he can do that. I mean, I'm of the opinion, when I listen to people telling me that Anthony Joshua can do things differently and can improve, that Alexander Usyk can also improve. If you think that he's fought Chaz Witherspoon, which in effect doesn't count, then Derek Chisora and now Anthony Joshua, there has to be scope. For me, there has to be scope for Alexander Usyk to improve once again. And I don't actually buy the theory, Steve, that Fury against Usyk is a snooze fest. I'd be absolutely fascinated to watch that fight, and I'd happily watch it next and get really buzzed about it. I think that's a great fight. It's got so many,
I agree.
Again, so many permutations about, you know, two classic boxing brains. I think it's absolutely fascinating. Can't see it being an up and downer like we saw 10 days or so ago, but fascinating fight, absolutely fascinating fight. And between two characters who I'm not sure could dent each other in the build-up, Steve. You know, you were talking about Fury biting against Wilder. I'm not sure either of them could get to the other.
No, Mike. If I'm not mistaken, they'd start the head-to-head press conference with them sharing a pot of tea. To turn it on its head. No, that's what I would do. I'd look to turn it on its head. I mean, Usyk, when I was interviewing Usyk before the Joshua fight, and I went down to one of those hotels in Stratford near the Olympic Stadium, and just trying to get him to understand, just trying to get him to even comprehend the idea that you try and get under somebody's skin. I mean, he just couldn't understand it. The Ukrainian gentleman in him could not quite grasp the idea that you try and inflict some type of pain on your opponent before the first bell. I mean, he looked quizzically at his advisors for them to see if it had been translated incorrectly. So you're absolutely right, Mike. But that would make that build up to Usyk and Fury even more fascinating.
Yeah,
the two guys behaving impeccably, just about to fight. I love that.
And they're compelling to watch in the build-up, Steve. You were around
Absolutely.
Fury all week, and people have been talking about how he's been singing in the dressing room and how he approaches the weigh-in. And, of course, he gets himself up for the press conference. And, as you said, he stepped over the line at times. Yeah. But generally speaking, he's so calm and so composed during fight week. And we were there at the edge of the stage when Alexander Usyk weighed in the day before the fight against Anthony Joshua, and he came back around to the side of the stage that I was at, and I was close to a barrier where some of the Ukrainian fans who turned up came down with a couple of flags and some photographs, and he was standing there talking to them and signing these photographs. And I remember taking a photograph and sending it to my son and saying, this man is just so at home here. He could not be more at home in this scenario a day before, one of, if not the biggest fight of his entire life, including his amateur career, Olympic finals and the rest. And yet he was just so calm, and it was as if he was just heading to another amateur tournament somewhere that he was expected to win the gold medal at. I was really struck by that. And that was the first time I thought all the way through that Joshua would win that fight, but that was the first time I got real doubts in my mind that it might not go his way. He just looked so composed.
Usyk's calm, Wilder's bravery, Joshua with a long road back, and Tyson Fury at the top of a hill. Boy, oh boy, special times, Mike, special days. Now, during all of that heavyweight carnage and chaos and madness and mayhem and joy, it was the end for Manny Pacquiao. Officially announced his retirement. I'm not even sure where to start with trying to assess and analyse and look at his career, Mike, but if you had to try and put it into a sentence, and you literally it was one of those on Radio 5 where you've run out of time and in your ear they say, you've got 15 seconds, tell me about Manny Pacquiao, what might you say?
I would say, Steve, that he is comfortably one of the greatest of all time. And in terms of my own personal experience, I have never covered in athletics or in boxing or in other sports earlier on in my career anybody who has had such an impact on his nation. I've never covered anybody who was idolised to the degree that Manny Pacquiao was. And you look at the achievements in the ring, it's about what he achieved and not just who he was outside of the ring as well. A very, very special performer in so many ways.
So the raw stats are 72 fights, 62 wins, 8 defeats, 2 draws. Fought first for the flyweight world title back in 1998 and was still fighting for a world title in his last fight just a few weeks ago when he lost. In the middle of that, take your pick. I mean, how would you? I mean, with him, Mike, you can almost pick out your best rematches and trilogies and quadruples. You're not talking about your best world title fight. And of course, some of his best fights, some of his greatest wins, most memorable, most historic wins, were not for any of the 4 recognised belts, which is something that's often overlooked. I calculate, Mike, and I'm intrigued to hear what you say. I calculate, I think I've written it down here somewhere, that he fought as many, in my opinion, as 30 monumental fights. 30 monumental fights. That seem about right to you?
And that's approaching half of his entire career, Steve. And that gives you an impression of just how much he's given to the sport. You and I grew up idolising Muhammad Ali, but we never got to cover any of his great nights and great fights. But when you think back to, even in the relatively short span across the wider boxing history, Steve, of our careers, who we've been lucky enough to see, but actually a lot of those are within the compass of Manny Pacquiao. If you think of Oscar De La Hoya and Floyd Mayweather and Miguel Cotto and Eric Morales, Marco Antonio Barrera, all of these came within the orbit of Manny Pacquiao, and that's without mentioning the man that he fought 4 times in Juan Manuel Marquez. And I just think it's remarkable, Steve. You can be picky about the claim to 8 world titles. You know, if we're talking in undisputed terms for the heavyweight title, we're talking about the 4 recognized governing bodies. In that sense, he won 6 world titles, but he boxed the elite in 8 divisions. So, you know, you can pick and choose, and you can argue about, you know, the merits of that, but he is truly a remarkable character. And you know, I was lucky enough to go to the Philippines 11 years ago now, Steve, in the build up to his fight against Antonio Margarito, which is another of those names. You know, I listed a whole range of names there and didn't include Margarito, and the Margarito performance at super welterweight might be one of the best of his career. Certainly I rate that very highly among his very best.
You know what, Mike? We talked there about the 6 recognised weights, but he actually won the titles, his 6 belts, over a 10-weight span. A 10-weight span, Mike. Flyweight, superfly, bantam, super bantam, feather, super feather, light welter, light middleweight. 10-weight span. I mean, this is just quite incredible. And you've seen the pictures, Mike, from all those years ago when he was in that gym in the Philippines, when he weighed less than the light flyweight limit. In fact, suggestion that when he won the flyweight title, he was weighing in with things in his pockets, when he looked malnourished. And then the early years with Bob Arum and Freddie Roach, and it's just story upon story. I mean, quite seriously, you know, you could pitch a Manny Pacquiao history podcast series to Sounds. There's a little bit of a suggestion for us. And you could do a 10-parter. No, quite comfortably. You could do a 10-parter. I don't see any problem. Any man that's had 72 fights, won world titles at that many weights, been involved in so many monumental fights against so many of the biggest names, boy, oh boy. Anyway, Mike, you did, as you mentioned there, go to see him in 2010. Lead us into that and tell me about that visit.
Yeah, this was in the build-up to his fight against Antonio Margarito, as I say, which he won. That was staged in Texas. So I went to the Philippines immediately after the Commonwealth Games of 2010, which was held in Delhi. And I flew on from Delhi straight to, direct to Manila, the capital of the Philippines. And I landed on a Saturday afternoon. And my flight was the last to land before the onset of not just a typhoon, but a super typhoon. They give them names like they do in the Western world, and this was Super Typhoon Juan, and it really did wreak havoc. Something like $250 million worth of damage was done over the course of the next 3 or 4 days, and that meant that virtually as soon as I arrived, we were confined to our hotel. We did a few interviews with various political figures because this was a pivotal time in the life of Manny Pacquiao. In May of that year, so in May of 2010, he'd become a congressman in the Philippines Parliament. So this was the first time that he was taking on twin roles. And I remember having a long conversation with Freddie Roach in the hotel that we were staying in his camp when we finally got there. And he was just making the first kind of noises about wondering how much Manny Pacquiao could do in boxing from there on if he was going to commit himself to politics as well. And it's remarkable that he's done what he has done over the ensuing 11 years. But we landed, as I say, on that Saturday afternoon, and we were meant to go to his training camp in a place called Baguio City, which is about a 5-hour drive from the capital, Manila, on the Sunday. But we couldn't get there till Wednesday or Thursday because of the weather situation. We were taking advice from the Meteorological Society, but also from the Red Cross, and the Red Cross told us categorically that we couldn't go for the first couple of days. So eventually we made our way up the mountains, and we get to his training camp, which was on an old military base which had been used during World War II. And the American influence on the Philippines, which had followed 400 years of Spanish influence, was very clear at this particular training camp. And we eventually made our way the following day to the gym. And all through the build-up, we'd been dealing with his manager, who at the time was a man called Mike Kontz. And he'd been promising that we would get time with Manny Pacquiao, and we wouldn't have gone all that way without the promise of talking to Manny Pacquiao. But when you get on the ground, you very quickly realise that Manny Pacquiao will talk if he wants to talk. It doesn't matter what bargains have been done, what deals have been made. If he doesn't want to talk, he won't talk. So I said to Freddie, what's the chances of us getting Manny Pacquiao at the gym or at the hotel? How should we play it? And he said, get yourself along to the gym. And once we've done a bit of sparring, you come into the gym, I'll talk to you. He'll see that I'm welcoming you as a friendly face, because I hadn't met Manny Pacquiao at this time. So we go along to the gym, sparring happens, and then his bandages are being taken off. And Freddie kind of beckoned me to the stairs by the ring. The ring was on a platform. I know in some gyms the ring is on the floor, but this was a ring that was on a platform with stairs by the side of it. And he said, just wait by the foot of the stairs, wait by the foot of the stairs. I can't tell him to do an interview, but if he wants to do an interview, he'll do it. So literally, once he'd taken his bandages off, I stood at the bottom of the stairs and he walked down and I said, look, I'm here from the BBC in London. We're making a documentary about you. We've been around town. We've spoken to this person, that person. And we'd spoken to one of his old trainers who trained him literally from when he was 9 and 10 years of age. And that seemed to be something that really clicked with him, that these were people who really had done their homework and had put themselves about. So he said, right, give me a minute and we'll do it. So he toweled himself down, put on a dry t-shirt, and then we start the interview. And very quickly into the interview, there was a load of noise around the ringside from various camp members just joshing about. And he stopped the interview and he shouted at these people to just calm down and be quiet. And it just struck me that it was one of those that if he was going to do it, he was going to do it properly. And it was just one of the most special moments of my career, Steve. It wasn't the most outstanding interview, but it was him, the politician and the boxer, and we got, his version of the story in the build up to one of the most important fights of his career. It was just a fascinating insight into how he developed and how he worked himself into not so much the fight mode, but how he conducted himself during fight time. And not unlike Tyson Fury, was very keen on what happened outside of training. And that very night, we went back to the hotel and they had a celebration because Mike Kontz, the man I mentioned earlier, had got married. And so they had a kind of a celebration in the hotel, and Manny Pacquiao took to the microphone. And as I've said before, he absolutely murdered a couple of songs, but we all gave him clearance for that.
Boy. Yeah, he's a bad.
Yeah, it was absolutely fascinating, Steve. And the whole trip after that, we went around to different places. We went back down to Manila. I remember going to a police station, Steve, because I wanted to nail this notion that when Manny Pacquiao fights in the Philippines, the crime rate drops virtually to zero. So I wanted to get some kind of handle on this. And we went into a police station in the centre of Manila. We got talking to a guy behind the desk, and of course, as soon as you mention Manny Pacquiao, everybody springs up. Loads of officers came to the front desk, and he actually showed me the logbook for the night of the last time that Manny Pacquiao had fought that time, around this time in 2010, and it was just a clear page. And they didn't know we were coming, so they couldn't have manufactured this. He just flicked back in the pages. It was this big, thick logbook. Olden style logbook. It wasn't computerized or anything. It was all just done in longhand. And he flicked back to the page of the last time Pacquiao had fought, and there was just a long blank page of nothing had been recorded. And okay, that was just one police station, in the capital Manila, and there are 7,000 islands, although most of them are uninhabited. But just that to me was just underlining how important a Manny Pacquiao fight night is. I say fight night, for them it happens at midday on a Sunday, because most of his massive fights have been nighttime in the US, and that's lunchtime the following day in the Philippines. And all around the country, squares and yards and cafes and pubs have screens, and it becomes a real kind of festival. And it's as I said earlier in the show, Steve, I've seen a couple of instances in my past: Ethiopia and the great long distance runner Haile Gebrselassie, Sachin Tendulkar in cricket in India. And they are followed in almost messianic style, but nothing, in my mind and in my experience, nothing came close to the adulation that's drowning around Manny Pacquiao.
It never grows tired, that trip you made down to the Philippines, Mike. Let's have a little listen.
Walking into the gym, there are young lads working on the speedballs, on the punch bags. At one end is a championship-sized ring, and that's where Pacquiao's training team are gathering with their kit bags, their mitts and pads and all sorts of bits and pieces of equipment. And at the moment, there's only one man missing.
Manny Pacquiao has just walked into the gym. He's here just a few feet away. He's sitting on a chair. He's undoing a band of sticky tape as he starts to wrap his hands with bandages which will protect his hands during sessions on the bags and the sparring sessions that are to come today. As he came into the ring, suddenly there was a hubbub, this kind of hum and a buzz around the place. Clearly something had happened, someone had happened, and that was Manny Pacquiao. How much of a burden do you find the expectation of the whole country here? We've been travelling around and everybody says that the Philippines comes to a standstill when you're fighting. Does that weigh heavily on your shoulders as you walk to the ring?
I have a great responsibility. Millions of people are expecting to my victory in every fight. I'm lucky every fight.
And people say you reflect the Filipino spirit. You embody the Filipino spirit. What would you say is special about people in this country?
You know, I love the Filipino people. And I'm doing this not only for myself, for my family, but also I'm doing this because of the honor of our country and the honor of the Filipino people.
This is a man approaching the peak of physical fitness. He's furiously working the pads. He looks just buoyant, and there's a smile on his face, even a cheeky moment to play the role of ring announcer, introducing himself.
What about once the bell rings, Manny? What's your mindset?
When I heard the bell ring, focus to the fight. You know, my focus is to the style of my opponent.
Do you feel any kind of fear or concern?
My fear is if I forget to pray to God. That's my fear. But as long as I'm always praying to God and believe God, I don't have fear. I live my life like every day is the last.
Now, Mike's documentary from 2010 is still available on BBC Sounds, and we'll put a link to it in the episode description. Mike, I've got to ask you, and I sort of hate doing this, a bit like prediction. If you had to pick, okay, let's do that Desert Island thing. You're taking just one Manny Pacquiao fight or memory to a boxing desert island. What are you taking?
I think, Stephen, it's a tough choice. I think I'd probably take the fight against Miguel Cotto from 2009, which for me showed so much of what Pacquiao is in terms of his ability to take a punch, his ability to dominate a fight, his ability to recover from spells in a contest which hadn't gone his way. But I thought that was just an exquisite display of everything that's good about him in terms of his footwork, his speed, his elusiveness, and ultimately his power. And there were elements of that, Steve. I watched it back again when I knew we were going to be talking about him. And you did a fantastic interview with Derek Chisora in the week leading up to Alexander Usyk against Anthony Joshua. And Chisora, I thought, gave the best insight I heard all week that week about what Usyk is and what he presents in the ring. And he spoke about how so often Usyk was hitting him on the blind side.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of that in Pacquiao against Cotto, where he would almost be moving off to the side to throw his punches. And so Cotto was always at a disadvantage in almost reaching across himself to try and catch Pacquiao. And I think that's what makes some southpaws so difficult for orthodox fighters to comprehend. That is, when they do come at them at those angles, like Usyk presented to Joshua and Pacquiao presented there to Miguel Cotto. And you look at the context of around that fight in 2009, Cotto at the time had only been beaten by Antonio Margarito. And when you consider that very soon after that, there was the controversy around the gloves with Margarito against Shane Mosley, then you could be led to believe that there was controversy around the gloves for Margarito against Cotto as well. But that was a pivotal time in Pacquiao's career, Steve. And later on in 2009, drifting into 2010, of course, were the long-winded negotiations for the fight against Floyd Mayweather, which was going to happen in May of 2010 and was going to be one of the all-time great fights. When you talk about misses, as we did at the beginning of the show, for all of us, that's one of the big misses of our careers.
Yeah, I think that will be not just a big miss of our career, maybe one of the biggest misses, if not the biggest miss in boxing, especially as what we finally saw. Well, I'm not quite sure if I could choose one. I remember the first time that he was shown as the main event in a fight that was shown on BBC, bizarrely. That was it wasn't live, the Barrera 1 fight back in about, I think, 2003. I think about some of the Marquez fights. I think about moments in the Morales fights. I think about the finish in the Hatton fight. I think about the Margarito fight. I think about the ruination of Oscar. It's a combination for me. And it's also, bizarrely, the 2015, the eventual fight between him and Floyd, because it was such a monumental fight with so many stories attached to it. And remember the ticket story. I was looking this up. When I knew that we would be doing a bit of this today, I didn't watch any fights. I looked at my notes. And I remembered how big the ticket story was for that fight. How no tickets were on sale, but they'd all sold out. Do you remember that, Mike? And that there was like 2 left at $13,656. And I can remember, so I found my old copy that I'd written in the Independent, and there it was, the whole of the week. In my eyes, I was just fixated with the tickets in a venue that had sold out, but no tickets were on sale. And I remember the day after, and as my ritual, I always stay an extra day in Las Vegas and end up in the MGM, and I go and have a steam and a sauna. And I remember I was sitting, lounging around in the MGM's spa lounge, and there was these couple of guys from Wales there, a couple of brothers from Cardiff. And, quite lively fellas, is a sort of euphemism. And they'd held out, they'd played the game, and they bought 2 ringside tickets, these $13,000 tickets. I think, and we did it on a show back then. I think they paid, I can't remember exactly, I think they paid something like $250, but they got in literally 3 minutes before the first bell sounded. So they'd had a real result. They ended up with about $27,000 worth of tickets for $500 or $600. Stories from Manny Pacquiao's life in the ring and in Las Vegas. Mike, if that's not a 10-part series for BBC Sounds, then I'm a Dutchman and you can call me Jan. I'm convinced.
Oh, Steve, even going back to, one of his defeats and the knockout when he was savagely knocked out by Juan Manuel Marquez in the last of their 4 fights back in 2012, the 6th round. And, Pacquiao had come back after a rough start and was winning the fight and then gets knocked out. And when he comes to, apparently from those who were in the ring, the first words he said were, "Where's Boo Boy?" Boo Boy Fernandez, his great friend and in the end one of his trainers, who he'd grown up with back in General Santos City. And he told me some of these stories. And within that documentary that you've mentioned, and it's a 2-parter, which, as you say, is available on BBC Sounds, I talked there to Boo Boy Fernandez, Steve, and he tells me about the very early days, both back in General Santos City, when each of them slept in cardboard boxes and they sold rice on street corners for what he said was the equivalent of 50 cents a day, and they were feeding each of their families on 50 cents a day. And he talks also about their early days in Las Vegas, Steve, when they would be shown to suites, and they would always be in the same suite. And in the early days, they would sleep on the floor rather than on the plush beds, because he said, you never know when we're going to go back there. You never know when it's going to be that hard again. They, for years and years in the early days, they just couldn't believe how lucky they were to be in this kind of new world. And, that link between Boo Boy Fernandez and Manny Pacquiao just is a vein that runs through the Pacquiao story, Steve. And as you say, it's got Netflix and a 10-part series or whatever written all over it,
Yeah, I remember you talk about Boo Boy there, because I think Boo Boy and him grew up together, but then they didn't see each other. And I think Manny had started to fight again when he saw him literally on the street somewhere, and again got him to come and work with him. And I read somewhere
Manny was taken to Manila, Steve, by a boxing scout. To take part in one of these kind of festivals that they had in the open air. They didn't even have rings up, Steve. It was like the old days in Britain when people used to just gather and create a ring, which is why the ring, which is square, got its name in the first place. But he was taken to Manila, and then the way he ended up in the United States. A Filipino manager, Rod Nazario, was going there in the early 2000s. He took Manny Pacquiao with him, took him to a gym in San Francisco. They didn't like it at the gym there. Who knows if he'd stayed at the gym in San Francisco, the story might not have been the same. So they moved on to Los Angeles, decided to have a go at the Wild Card gym. Freddie Roach takes him on the pads, can't believe the power and the zap of the man on the pads, and suddenly the Manny Pacquiao story is alive and kicking. It's breathtaking. It's breathtaking.
It is a story from scraping the rust off of recycled metal for $1 a week to leaving boxing after 72 fights and possibly running for president. They don't make stories like that, son. You can't invent stories like that. That's what I felt when I was ringside, watching Tyson Fury get up and down and watching Deontay Wilder get up and down. I was wondering if that fight was ever going to end. A bit like this podcast, really, Mike. Well, it's good to have you back, son.
I know.
It's been good to have you back.
Just talking about that, Steve, to finish, I mean, the great podcast that I was listening to during the Fury fight week, but, just thinking back, the podcasts we could have done in Manila and elsewhere, Baguio City, around that Manny Pacquiao trip. Bob Arum was there, Freddie Roach was there, Boo Boy Fernandez was there. It was, going to church with Manny and going to the gym with him, and just talking to all sorts of people around him. It would have been a wonderful podcast feature.
Listen, son, there's plenty of time for that. We'll do plenty more of those. Well, it's been a pleasure, an absolute delight. Mike, enjoy yourself the next couple of weeks, and we'll see you. We'll all be together October the 30th, I'm assuming.
Yeah, that'd be great. Dillian White, Otto Wallin, and as we were saying right at the start of the show, suddenly that has a whole new look around it, doesn't it? There's a whole new perspective around that fight now.
Mike, thanks for joining me today to talk about Manny Pacquiao and to look back at that incredible night in Las Vegas. I'll be back next week, where I'll look forward to Dillian White against Otto Wallin, a fight that will be live on BBC 5 Live. It's been a busy few weeks, that's for sure.
Let's get ready to rumble! 5 Live Boxing.